Hi, you guys. Welcome to Marx Part 1 for History of Thought 2. And I'm going to do things a little differently today. I'll move the video over in a minute, but I'm going to narrate my slides, but you'll be able to also see me on a video for part of the time, I think all of the time, and then I'll kind of cut the video to the middle and to the corner variously, depending on what we're going to be doing. But, I typically start out Marx, and this works better when it's live, and we're all face to face in a class together. But I typically start out asking Marx, what would you do if you didn't have to worry about money? So if you could live, let's say, kind of a comfortable middle class lifestyle without needing a job, what would you do? And what would society look like if we could all live that way? Would humanity stagnate or would we flourish? And what's preventing us in the present system from the world being this way? Do we have enough resources, technology, and material wealth to guarantee that everybody could kind of live a basic, comfortable life? And if it's not an issue of resources or technology or material wealth, if it's sort of possible in terms of technology, in terms of resources, then why do we have such huge wealth disparities in our society? So these are all the kinds of questions that Marx will be addressing. You kind of see we have the Communist Party here. Haha, party, haha. Anyway, so Marx is addressing these kinds of questions, but he's addressing them from the perspective of the mid-1800s. So I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context, but first I want to kind of give you an overview of both today's lecture and then Marx Part 2, the different ways that we can see Marx, and we can see sort of where his work and his ideas and his philosophy fit in. So we can see Marx as first a philosopher of history and of the human condition. And this is when he starts to ask questions like, what does it mean to be human? How can we fulfill our individual and collective potential as humans? What moves history and what causes historical change? We can also see Marx as an observer of capitalism as it is operating in the mid-1800s in Europe. So he's observing how capitalism works, which is a relatively new system at that time. What are its effects on humans? And sort of his speculation about whether the system will last or not, and why or why not. And finally, we can see Marx as sort of this activist, somebody with a revolutionary political agenda. So the first two, sort of philosopher of history and the human condition, and kind of observer of capitalism and and how it operates. These are both kind of more academic, objective-ish positions. But the third way we can think of Marx is really kind of as this political activist with a revolutionary political agenda. What should the future look like, and how do we get there practically? So just a little bit of background. Karl Marx is one of the most influential thinkers in not just in the West, but in the world in the past 200 years. And he often collaborates with Friedrich Engels, who you're reading for next time the Communist Manifesto that he wrote explicitly with. So Marx is kind of the intellectual. He writes lots of books and articles about political philosophy and economics, and Engels is more of the financial backer and the popularizer of Marx. And actually, Engels does a lot to popularize Marx writing after Marx dies in 1883. Engels outlives him by 12 years. So Karl Marx, born in 1818 in what is now Germany, but at that point, there were various Germanic states. But he was culturally, linguistically German, to a middle-class family. His family's lineage is Jewish, but his father converted the family to Christianity, specifically to Lutheranism, to keep his job as a lawyer, which was not uncommon for Jews at that time in Europe. Marx receives his PhD in philosophy, but he can't get a university job because he's openly an atheist, which kind of in the mid-1800s is not really a great position to be in. And increasingly also because of his what we would call socialist and sort of radical left-wing political sympathies. So initially he becomes a journalist. And he starts writing about kind of revolutionary events from a left-wing perspective. In the 1840s, he has to leave Germany because of his political views. First, he goes to Paris and then to England after sort of the failure of this big revolution in France in 1848. Actually, there's revolutions all over Europe in 1848. He's living through the one in France, but it kind of fails. And he lives the rest of his life kind of in political exile in London. Frederick Engels is the son of a wealthy German bourgeoisie factory owner, and he actually spends a lot of time working at his family's textile families in Manchester, England. So he's German, but they own these textile factories in Manchester. And he's increasingly appalled by the working conditions he sees, so he starts to support socialist ideas, and he financially supports Marx and his work for most of his adult life. Of course, Marx kind of lives in near poverty most of his life. Frederick Engels, he's kind of the limousine liberal. You know, he still has all the wealth from his father's textile plants, but he's using it to live a pretty decent lifestyle and then also promote sort of radical socialist ideals. So what exactly do we mean by the Industrial Revolution? I mean, this is the context in which Marx is writing. This is also a major, major transformation in human history that he's witnessing. So the Industrial Revolution, the sort of dictionary historical definition, is the shift from an agrarian and handicraft economy to an industry and machine manufacturing economy. So industrialization is this fundamental transformation in how humans make things. And if we think about kind of major, major transformations in human history, you know, the adoption of agriculture and sort of settled sort of living conditions by humans like 10,000 years ago. The invention of writing, the invention of the wheel, the invention of the printing press, like these are all huge things. The Industrial Revolution probably is more important than all of them, maybe with the exception of the adoption of agriculture. But this is this huge fundamental transformation in human life. So the Industrial Revolution means mechanized production. It means the factory system. It means power sources beyond humans and animals. Means rapid urbanization, growing populations, peasants moving into cities looking for work, the increasing economic and political power of middle classes, of the bourgeoisie. So remember from a few classes ago, a few lectures ago, that old feudal system of peasants and knights and lords, and it's definitely being broken down as you have all of these other kinds of occupations and people that are sort of the middle classes. And not only that, but the peasants are all moving to the cities and getting transformed in sort of industrialized urban working class. So you have both the increasing political power of this middle class, right? The merchants and the shopkeepers and the lawyers and the doctors and all of these kinds of people, but also this creation of what Marx calls the proletariat, the urban working class, right? You don't have peasants in an industrial economy because farming is mechanized. You have factory workers. But of course, with the Industrial Revolution, we all also in the 1800s think of horrific working and living conditions in the cities. So overcrowding, bad sanitation, long working hours, unsafe working conditions, low pay, lots of use of child labor, no laws against that sort of thing. Clearly, initially, no benefits like sick leave or health care. I mean, this is kind of like, what Charles Dickens is describing in a lot of his books. So this is what Marx is living through. He's living through sort of this rapid transformation of society from an agricultural society to an industrial one. And it's happening fast in Europe, and to some extent in the US at this time too. Also, though, during Marx's lifetime, you're starting to see this urban working class, these factory workers start to organize. So he's witnessing the first trade unions, the first early socialist political movements that sort of precede Marx. And Marx is trying to explain in detail what he sees as driving all of these changes. It's really for him the rise of what he sees as the capitalist system of production and the connected rise of these two new classes of people, the bourgeoisie, sort of these middle classes, and the proletariat, the urban factory worker. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail and what they mean. But first, I kind of want you to take a pause and think about, what do we mean by capitalism? So Marx is sort of describing the development of capitalism, and that's what he's witnessing. But what exactly do we mean by that? It's kind of one of these words that is so a part of our culture and so saturates everything that it's just really even hard to define. Um, a lot of times people throw out ideas, markets, um, that's kind of an important part of it. Wage labor, private factories, private ownership, all of these different things. If we're in class, we could create a list. But really, at its most basic, capitalism is an economic system based on the idea of capital accumulation. Okay, so it's an economic system based on the idea of capital accumulation. Okay, sure. So what's capital? I mean, capital is obviously the central word in capitalism, right? So what's capital? So capital, sort of the dictionary definition, is factors of production used to create goods and services. So on one level, capital, things like factories, equipment, machinery, the things that we use to produce goods and services, to make other things, like a factory is a great example. But in a capitalist economy, capital can also mean money being invested. And this is how Marx primarily uses it. So it kind of has this double meaning, both kind of like the physical factors of production, machinery, equipment, factories, right, that you need to make other stuff, but also money to invest. Because to make other stuff, you need to invest money to be able to buy factories and equipment and machinery and to pay people, right? So capital is really money that you're going to invest. So capital accumulation, now we can take a step back, is the investment of money or a financial asset for the purpose of accumulating more money. So capitalism is essentially the investment of money in the expectation of making a profit. So a capitalist society is one where almost all economic activities are driven by the possibility of making a profit, right? Making more money beyond what you put into it from the investment of capital. And that investment of capital could just be money, or it could be machine, equipment, etc. So not to say that in sort of previous economic systems, in history prior to the past couple hundred years, there certainly were economic activities driven by the possibility of making a profit, but they weren't overwhelmingly all economic activities. And by economic activity, I mean any kind of production of goods and services. I mean, a lot of production of goods or services before capitalism was simply done within a household, right, for your own use. If you needed new shoes, you'd make some out of leather, or maybe you'd bargain or trade, or maybe sort of you'd exchange with other people in your community, but it would not necessarily be based on making a profit, right? And there are people who are focused on making a profit. There's bankers and there's merchants, but it isn't what fundamentally defines at its core the entire economic system before capitalism. And in capitalism, it's where almost all kinds of activity, economic activities, so activities that are directed at producing, at making goods and services, that all of those activities overwhelmingly are driven by the possibility of making a profit, of accumulating more money. And when that money is sort of reinvested in machines and technology, that are then used to increase production of these marketable goods and services. So capitalism is inherently an expansive system because of this drive for profit. So capitalists are always looking for new markets, new consumers, new goods. Marx often talks about the restless energy of capitalism. Think about kind of this typical business advice. If you're not growing, you're stagnating. What's the point of having money under capitalism? I mean, I guess kind of it is to buy stuff, but it's really to use it to make more. So it's this dynamic, expansive system that constantly has to keep growing if the point is accumulating capital, accumulating money. So there's other aspects of capitalism that are all part of modern capitalism, but we can think of sort of examples or exceptions where you have capitalist practices without them. So private ownership of the means of production and of industry, right? So the means of production are these physical, non-human inputs used in production, factories, machines, tools, etc. Or capital, right? Which is when it's used as a means of production. So private ownership of industry is basically what this is. Just a second. So really, private ownership of the means of production means private ownership of industry. So factories and companies, that make stuff are not owned by the state. They're owned privately. And that's also often a fundamental part of capitalism. So wage labor is also often seen as a fundamental aspect of capitalism. And by wage labor, we mean a system where individuals can freely sell their labor on a market, right? So this is kind of contra peasants during feudalism. Peasants are tied through a system of obligations to a lord to a particular piece of land. And legally, it's very hard. They can't just go to another lord and be like, I'm going to farm your land or move to a different place. They're sort of tied to that land under a system of obligations. They really, it's not like you can just go find a job somewhere else under the feudal system. So in a capitalist system, you don't have that. You have individuals being able to sort of sell their labor for a wage anywhere. And it's also a system where most individuals do not directly sell the products of their labor. So if I work in a factory that makes shoes, right, I'm not selling the shoes directly. I'm paid a wage for creating the sole of the shoe by the company, by the capitalist, who then uses sort of the fruits of my labor and the fruits of many other people's labor to sell that product and make a profit. So typically in a very simple wage labor system, the profit that capitalists are making is not something that gets passed along to employees. Of course, in more contemporary complex capitalist systems, you do have things like stock options and profit sharing and that sort of thing. But, Marx is looking at kind of early capitalism in the mid 1800s. Of course, Marx will ask, how is this kind of system not as free for laborers as it seems? I mean, we call it, individuals are free to sell their labor in a market. They can choose to go to one employer to another, to move to this city, to do that city. But realistically, given the kind of money that they're making and given kind of the conditions of their life, are they really that economically free to be able to work wherever they want to? Probably not. What about free markets? What about competitive and free markets? So we often see these as part of capitalist economies. And sort of free markets and open markets are things that pre-exist capitalism by thousands of years. I mean, there's spaces in world history that have had sort of these open marketplaces where people can come kind of freely and exchange and buy and sell goods and services. But the idea of a free market where goods and services can sort of be exchanged freely and openly, and the price, right, is determined by the market, determined by supply and demand. That's often seen as an inherent part of capitalism. But it doesn't necessarily have to be part of a capitalist economy. It doesn't necessarily have to be part of an economy based on capital accumulation, on investing money to make more money. I mean, I think China is a great example, which is sort of kind of a free market, but definitely not in a lot of ways. So what's wrong with this system for Marx? Why does he find it so exploitative, so alienating, so contradictory? And why does he actually thinks ultimately it's going to be replaced by something else according to his views on history? I mean, it isn't all bad, and we'll get to that. He isn't like saying, oh, this is terrible, nothing good comes out of it. He has a lot of kind of positive things to say about it, but he thinks there's just, we can do better. So to get kind of to this larger picture of Marx's critique of capitalism, what I want to do is introduce you some of his main concepts and parse some of the main ideas from the readings, and then we'll put them together in a larger picture, which will continue in our next class on Marx. So we're about halfway through right now. We're about 20 minutes in. So if you want to take a break and then come back to the lecture, now would be a really good time to do so. So one of the first concepts that's really important for understanding Marx and also understanding his critique of capitalism is the idea of alienation. Actually, I'm going to go back to my big screen. So this is often a time where I pause and we talk about the kind of jobs that we work. So what kind of job do you have right now? Think about the job that you work. Do you like it? Why or why not? Is it similar to the kind of job you would like after you graduate? And what kind of job do you actually think you'll be doing? So, I get a lot of responses like crappy retail jobs or, sort of mind-numbing office jobs sitting in a cubicle. If you think about the kind of work that Marx was observing in terms of the industrial working class, he's observing people in a factory assembly line spending hours upon hours a day just doing the same repetitive motion over and over again. So maybe you're nailing the shoes, the nailing the heel into the shoe over and over and over again as shoes kind of come by on an assembly line. So, it's a very sort of mind-numbing and repetitive work. But, we can kind of think of a lot of contemporary jobs as very mind-numbing and soul-sucking and repetitive. And I mean, certainly we're not, 19th century industrial factory workers, but Marx would say there that even a lot of contemporary work is just as alienating. So what exactly do we mean by alienation? Well, to understand that, we have to understand Marx's idea about I hate to say human nature, because he really thinks human nature is quite flexible and variable depending on the economic system you live in. But if there's any kind of essence that he sees as common to all humans, it's this idea of species being, that we are creative beings and that creative labor is innate to our nature as humans, producing things, interacting with the environment to make things ourselves, right? This is work, but not in a bad sense, like in a positive sense. This is what gives life meaning for humans, for Marx. And it isn't just Marx who's saying this. There's a lot of other thinkers, kind of in the Enlightenment tradition, and Marx is drawing a lot on the Enlightenment tradition, who are looking at sort of the importance of creative work in human endeavors, so that we are productive animals and we gain fulfillment for Marx through what we would freely and consciously produce without constraint. Also, for Marx, humans are naturally social animals. We're not necessarily naturally selfish, but certain social and economic structures, maybe like capitalism, make us so. So Marx would say that we are truly conscious of ourselves as a species, as a human species, when kind of we recognize this consciousness, this kind of innate desire to create and produce and to make. When we recognize that in ourselves, and we also recognize that in other humans, that we feel connected to other humans through that kind of mutual desire. And this tendency is often translated as species being or species nature. So for Marx, really, what capitalism does fundamentally is it alienates us from our species being. So how? How does it do this? So alienation, kind of the standard definition, is this disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Okay? And alienation for Marx really is how we have this sense of exclusion and separation from ourselves and from one another under capitalism. That the increased specialization of work under industrial capitalism, it does increase efficiency and profit. So instead of one person sort of crafting as sort of an artisan an entire shoe, if you have 1,000 people working in a shoe factory, each doing one small part of the assembly, that's more efficient. You're going to make a lot more shoes. And a lot more people are going to get a lot more shoes. I mean, in some ways, that's progress, right? Maybe there's more shoes available and people don't have to go shoeless, or they can replace their shoes sooner. And that's great in some ways. But It's also incredibly monotonous and unsatisfying work, that you're a cog in a machine. If you're one of these workers who's just doing the same repetitive task over and over and over and over again, and clearly not something that you would choose to do on your own time, that this is fundamentally psychologically unsatisfying, that we have no control over what we produce and how, right? This is controlled by our boss as representing sort of the interests of the factory owner. And work becomes only a means to existence, right? It's only to get that paycheck to survive. Work is not part of our creative essence. Work becomes a bad word. And this is what Marx calls estranged labor. So we become alienated from labor. We're estranged labor. We become alienated from ourselves and our kind of true creative nature. But we also become alienated from others as well. Instead of kind of recognizing this sort of this species being, this sort of similarity in each other, and and recognizing each other as human beings, we see other people as competitors, right? Who could take our jobs at any minute or advance above us, right? And especially during the kind of 1800s industrial revolution, when you have all of these peasants who have been pushed off their land, pouring into the cities, looking for work. Marx calls this the reserve army of labor. If you don't want your horrible job pounding heels into shoes over and over again, there's 100 other people who are unemployed waiting to take it. And they're all your competitors, right? They're not your sort of fellow uh, uh, creators, right? They're your competitors. Or if there's if the factory manager job is open and they're going to hire someone from the floor, all of the people that you work with are your competitors. Or you're getting a bonus on how many nails into the heel of the shoe you pound. All your other people that are putting the same nails in the same place in the shoe, only one of you is going to get the bonus. You're competing with this. So it alienates us from each other. So capitalism alienates us from ourselves and these true natures, that our labor produces things that become external to us, commodities. They become commodified. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we ultimately, these things that we sort of make with our labor, that we sort of help partly make, that we're getting a wage for, we ultimately have to use our wages to buy them back. So even if you make shoes or make a part of a shoe, then ultimately they're just stuff that you have to buy in the market. You just have to buy like a shoe in the market. It isn't like this sort of pride of creation. And capitalists really own the labor power of the individuals that produce for them, right? The individuals that are actually doing the work aren't really getting any part of the profit. So Marx says, first, the fact that labor is external to the worker. It does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working. When he is working, he does not feel at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice or mortification. Lastly, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but of someone else's, and that it does not belong to him, that in it he belongs, not to himself, but to another. Just as in religion, to the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain, and the human heart operates on the individual independently of him, that is, operates as an alien, divine, or diabolical activity, so is the worker's activity not his spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of his self. Right? So in capitalism, we have lost ourselves, our true self, our true nature, because we're not sort of allowed to engage in this kind of creative productive labor that gives us fulfillment. Right? What we do for work is in no way what we would choose to do. So another thing that Marx talks about in terms of capitalism and sort of what capitalism does to the human condition is this idea of commodity fetishism. And this is when we shift to not our labor, but the products of the labor, the things that we're making at the factory, the things that we ultimately have to buy to satisfy our needs and wants with the wages that we make. So how does this work under capitalism? So to understand the idea of commodity fetishism, we have to take a step back, take a lot of steps back with Marx, and understand the idea of a commodity. So what exactly is a commodity? These things that we have to buy to satisfy our wants and our needs, right? What exactly is it? So very simply, a commodity is something that can be bought and sold. And you often will hear the term to commoditize something. So to commoditize something is to turn it into something that can be bought and sold. Objects, right? So chairs and pencils and t-shirts, but also services, right? Haircuts and medical advice and all sorts of different kinds of things where you're not buying a good, you're buying a service. But basically any good or service that you have to pay money for, right, is a commodity. It can be bought and sold in a capitalist system. So why does a commodity have a particular value? Why do we see it as valuable and something that we should spend money on to buy? And this is where Marx starts to kind of disentangle this idea of a commodity a little bit. So there's kind of this false view under capitalism that Marx talks about, that commodities have some sort of natural and inherent value. Right? Money, price, brand, quality, etc., are all human social constructs. And you can think about it like, why is it that you buy the clothes that you're wearing? Right? I mean, they're functional, right? You need something to cover your body so you don't get cold or whatever. But there's also a lot of other stuff imbued in that commodity that we often think of as connected to price or connected to quality, to brand, to trend, to all of these different things, and identity in some ways too. So we're going to disentangle all of this. So Marx talks about how in capitalism, commodities are fetishized. And fetish he takes from the notion of anthropology, where in anthropology is sort of a nascent discipline in the mid-1800s, but it refers in sort of anthropology in the 1800s to a sacred or symbolic object that, according to its worshipers, has supernatural powers. So Marx is sort of making the analogy that we're imbuing in commodities an almost kind of supernatural power. And I mean, he's a materialist. He doesn't believe in the supernatural, but he's saying this is kind of what humans do, that commodities become sort of sacred in a sense, and that there's this sense when you consume them that there's something more beyond just the, oh, I need a shirt because I'm cold. But why that shirt? What is it that you get out of consuming it? So this is a quote from one of the readings that you had, I think, about commodity fetishism. So this is what Marx says about commodities. A commodity appears at first sight, a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is, in reality, a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is a value in use, there is nothing mysterious about it. Whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it is capable of satisfying human wants, or from the point of view that those properties are in the product of human labor. It is as clear as noonday that man, by his industry, changes the forms of the materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet, for all of that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But as soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than table turning ever was. It's a nice use of language, nice translation. But, what does this mean? What does this mean? So the first half, he's really talking about this idea that, there is what Marx calls usefulness. There is kind of this use value, right? That, we need things like tables and chairs and shirts, and also recognizing that sort of part of the value in an object is the fact that we need it and that we will use it. And also, too, that we put human labor into making it, right? That's also a part of it. That use value is really about how a commodity fulfills a need that we have as humans. We need tables, we need to sit down, we need clothes, right? That's fine. And human labor goes into that, right? But there's still an extra something more about a table or a t-shirt or a chair when it becomes a commodity, when we can buy it and sell it. That's kind of this extra something that for Marx, he says people almost kind of fetishize that, and it's something that's almost mystical, not in actuality, but people sort of behave. It's that extra something. In some ways, Marx would say that this is seen in what is called exchange value, right? So exchange value is the ratio in which one good is exchanged for another. So why is it that you can get 20 Gap t-shirts for one Armani t-shirt, right? They're both t-shirts. So if we want to think about the use value, they're both the same. And maybe they could be slightly different. Maybe if one was really carefully crafted and a lot of extra labor went into it, or maybe it's like a warmer material, like those can affect use value. But let's imagine it's the same damn t-shirt. One just says Gap and one just says Armani. The exchange value would indicate that one has a lot more value. So where does that come from? It implies that commodities have some kind of intrinsic value, that there's something about that Armani t-shirt that's more valuable. It's almost mystical. So what is it? And again, like we sort of fetishize it. And a lot of times it's the easy way to think about it is it's kind of based on, trends or labels or why is it that we want to wear an Armani t-shirt? Because it makes us seem cool, right? Well, of course it's better. And even when you put aside all of these things about sort of fabric difference and how much labor went into it, there's still something intrinsic about consuming that. Imagine like going to the coffee shop and drinking, the latte that's created by your favorite barista. And there's something special and different and so pleasurable about that. Or maybe not, but you can think of something similar, right? That's different than maybe going to Starbucks and getting the same product, right? It's still caffeine and dairy put together, but it's this is what that extra something. Hold on a second. Okay, sorry for the dog barking interruption. So back to commodities and commodity fetishism. So for Marx, we almost we imbue commodities with almost mystical-like properties, often seen as inherent to the object. If we wear this shirt, if we drink that beverage, if we watch that TV show, then we'll be happy. That consumption, not of just drinking a beverage, but that particular one, right? There's something about that consumption which makes us feel better. Right. I'm going to put up a link to a video by a contemporary Marxist philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, where he talks about commodity fetishism. It's a clip from actually one of his movies, and he sort of explains it really well from a psychological point of view. But really, it's kind of about understanding how commodities help construct our sense of self and identity, right? Who are we? What defines us? What do we watch? What do we read? What do we listen to? What do we wear? Right? These are all commodities, and consuming them gives us pleasure. But from a Marxist perspective, this in a lot of ways is very surface and artificial. It's a fleeting pleasure. It's a pleasure where we have to keep consuming more and more. I mean, Zizek actually talks about the pleasure of consuming a Coca-Cola, right? Coke is it. Coke is the real thing, and that you drink a sip and it's very pleasurable. But then you have to keep drinking more to keep regaining that experience. That commodities, help construct the consumption helps us sort of create this sense of self, but that this is an artificial sense of self, that our pleasure in consuming these fantasies in some ways helps us deal with alienation and the fact that we're being sort of alienated from our true natures under capital and our species being that instead of sort of creatively making and making and creating and constructing using our labor, that's sort of real true deep pleasure, that we're just sort of like consuming commodities in a very sort of surface way. So another level of commodity fetishism is also about the failure to appreciate the human labor that went into a commodity's production. That if we're really kind of focusing on the thing itself, that we're sort of valuing like this shirt or this table or this drink, for kind of this what it can sort of help construct in terms of the experience and our sense of self. Right? What we're really doing also is ignoring the fact that this is something made by other people, that commoditizing it sort of makes us ignore the fact that a lot of human labor went into creating it. And we're sort of alienating ourselves from other human beings who created the things that we're consuming. So think about like who made the shirt that you're wearing? What were the conditions of their labor? The value that we as we talked about, the value that we give to these products, the ultimate sort of price that's put on them, really has no direct connection to their actual usefulness or the labor that went into their production. In a lot of ways, it's about the Armani t-shirt, not the Gap t-shirt, even if the labor was exactly the same. And so, commodity fetishism not only kind of gives us these fleeting pleasures of commodity consumption that are maybe masking deeper issues of alienation, but it's also sort of alienating us from the other human beings who are actually physically making these products. So alienation and commodity fetishism are two really important concepts in Marx, and you can see kind of how they're working together and sort of his critiques of capitalism. And, so what would it be like to live in a world where, we weren't sort of consuming commodities for these fleeting pleasures, that we weren't alienated? And we'll come back to this quote next time, but Marx, this is sort of a famous quote by Marx in terms of his idea of an ideal society. In a communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. So next time we're going to talk more about Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, and come back to this quote and sort of Marx's idea for how could we possibly overcome sort of these problems of capitalism.